At the western edge of Russia, in Kaliningrad, the evening news can be starting while people in the Far East are already waking up to a new day. That sounds like a trick of the map until you realize it is the map itself doing the trick. Russia is so wide that sunrise and sunset cannot happen at the same time in any meaningful way. Not across a country that stretches from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean. And yet a nation still has to function like a single machine. Flights have to depart on schedule. Power grids have to balance demand. Military units, schools, factories, and TV networks all have to agree on what the clock means. Time zones are the compromise between astronomy and administration. They are a set of lines humans draw on a planet that refuses to cooperate. In Russia, that compromise becomes extreme because the country's width forces an extreme choice. Either accept many time zones or accept that large regions will live with a clock that simply does not match the sun. In a country stretching thousands of kilometers from west to east, that mismatch would quickly become obvious in everyday life. Morning routines, work schedules, and evening activities would drift far away from the natural cycle of daylight. Creating multiple time zones is the practical solution that keeps daily life somewhat aligned with the movement of the sun. The simplest reason Russia has so many time zones is geometry. The Earth rotates once about every 24 hours. That rotation is 360 degrees, so the planet turns about 15 degrees of longitude per hour. If you move 15 degrees east, local solar time shifts about 1 hour later. At the equator, that's straightforward. Even at higher latitudes, where daylight length changes with the seasons, the basic relationship between longitude and solar noon still holds. When the sun is highest in the sky, that's noon in the original physical sense. Time zones are built to keep local noon from drifting too far away from the middle of the day on the clock. Now look at Russia's span. From Kaliningrad in the west to Chukotka in the far northeast, the country crosses a huge portion of the globe's longitudes. In its modern system, Russia runs from UTC plus 2 hours to UTC plus 12 hours. That is a 10-hour spread inside one country. This enormous distance means the country operates across dramatically different daily schedules, with regions separated by many hours of daylight and darkness. The difference is so large that sunrise, work schedules, and daily life unfold at completely different moments across the country. For comparison, the contiguous United States spans 4 main time zones, from Eastern to Pacific, a 3-hour difference. Russia is dealing with more than triple that, and it's doing it across territories that are not empty on a map. There are cities, ports, mines, military bases, and entire regional economies living under those clocks. Each of those regions depends on a reliable local schedule to keep transportation, industry, and communication running smoothly. Managing time across such a vast and populated landscape requires a system that respects both geography and the practical needs of the people living there. A lot of people assume time zones are natural, like climate zones, but they're not. The natural thing is local solar time, and for most of human history, that's what people used. Noon was when the sun was highest, and the exact minute didn't matter much if your fastest travel was a horse. That changed when railroads showed up, because trains make time visible. If a train leaves one city at 10 o'clock and arrives in another at 10:30, you need the two cities to agree on what 10 o'clock means. In the 1800s, that problem forced standard time into existence across industrial countries. Russia felt that pressure more than almost any other nation because of distance. The classic symbol is the Trans-Siberian Railway, running roughly 9,289 kilometers from Moscow to Vladivostok, crossing forests, plains, mountains, and major rivers. A journey can take about a week, and the train crosses multiple time zones along the way. Along that route, the landscape itself changes dramatically. Dense European forests give way to the vast plains of Siberia, then to mountain ranges and river systems that stretch for thousands of kilometers. Each region operates under its own local time, which means a traveler can experience several different clocks during a single journey across the country. Without standardized time, rail schedules and safety systems become a mess. Standard time zones are not just a convenience in that setting, they are infrastructure. Railway operators must coordinate departures, arrivals, track usage, and maintenance across enormous distances. Even a small timing error could cause confusion between stations hundreds of kilometers apart. Establishing clear time zones allows rail networks, communication systems, and control centers to operate with predictable timing, making long-distance transportation possible in a country as vast as Russia. Even after time zones exist, Russia still has to decide how many to use and where to place the boundaries. In theory, you could draw perfect vertical strips, each about 15 degrees wide, following longitude lines. In practice, almost no country does that cleanly. Time zone borders usually follow political borders, because it is easier for an entire region to share one clock than to split cities and provinces into different times. Russia is divided into federal subjects, and time zone boundaries tend to follow those administrative edges. That's why some zones bulge and bend instead of looking like neat slices of an orange. It's governance shaping time. There's another twist that makes Russia feel even stranger on a clock: latitude. Much of Russia sits far north. That doesn't change the number of hours between longitudes, but it changes the daily experience of time. In winter, high-latitude regions have short daylight hours. In summer, they can have extremely long days, and in the far north, the sun may not set at all for stretches. When your daylight is doing that, the clock becomes less about matching sunrise and sunset and more about coordinating society. People still want a workday, a school day, a delivery schedule. Time zones are a social tool trying to stay sane in extreme daylight conditions. If geography explains why Russia needs multiple time zones, politics explains why the exact number has changed. Russia currently uses 11 time zones, but it hasn't always. In 2010, the government reduced the number from 11 to 9, consolidating some regions. The argument was that fewer zones would improve administrative coordination and make it easier to manage a country from a central government. From the perspective of policymakers in Moscow, fewer time zones could simplify communication between ministries, businesses, and national institutions that operate across the entire country. A smaller number of clocks meant fewer adjustments when scheduling meetings, broadcasts, and national events. But that decision collided with daily life. When you merge time zones, you can end up pushing the clock away from the sun. In places far from the center of a zone, noon on the clock can drift late into the afternoon, and winter mornings can become darker for longer. For people living in those regions, the change was noticeable. School schedules, commuting hours, and work routines began drifting further from natural daylight patterns. What looked efficient on a national map did not always feel practical on the ground, especially in northern regions where winter daylight is already limited. Those complaints were not theoretical. People organized their lives around morning light, commuting, and school start times. When the clock pushes sunrise later, you can end up with kids going to school in darkness for much of the year, or workers starting shifts long before daylight. The government eventually reversed course. In 2014, Russia restored 11 time zones and also made a separate major decision. It stopped seasonal clock changes. Russia does not use daylight saving time anymore, and it has stayed on permanent standard time since October 26, 2014. For a few years before that, from March 27, 2011 to October 26, 2014, Russia experimented with permanent summertime, keeping clocks 1 hour ahead all year. That policy also drew complaints, especially about dark winter mornings, and it was dropped. These shifts reveal a key point. Time zones are not only a response to Earth's rotation, they are also the result of laws, economic priorities, and public tolerance. Russia's 11 zones are a balance between the physical need created by longitude and the political need to keep regions functional. A clock may seem like a simple measurement of time, but at a national scale, it becomes part of how a country organizes work, transportation, communication, and daily routines. Governments have to consider how businesses operate, how schools schedule their days, and how different regions interact with each other economically. In a country as large as Russia, those decisions become especially complex. Regions thousands of kilometers apart may share the same government, but live under very different daylight conditions and economic connections. Time zones therefore become a practical compromise, shaped not only by the movement of the planet, but also by the needs of the people and institutions that rely on the clock every day. To understand what 11 zones actually means on the ground, it helps to walk across them in your mind. In the far west, Kaliningrad operates at UTC +2. 1 hour ahead is Moscow time, UTC +3, which covers most of European Russia and includes the capital. From there, you move into Samara time at UTC plus 4, then Yekaterinburg time at UTC plus 5, and deeper into Siberia and the Far East, the offsets keep climbing. Eventually, you reach Kamchatka and Chukotka at UTC plus 12. The names change, the cities change, and the sun's schedule changes with them. If you live in Moscow, that structure also hides a psychological effect. Moscow time becomes the reference. The capital is where the political center is, where many major broadcasters operate, and where national decisions are announced. For years, that center reference was literal in transport. Russian railways timetables traditionally used Moscow time for consistency across long routes. That made sense for a unified schedule, but it also meant a traveler had to constantly translate Moscow time into local time when boarding or arriving. In 2018, that practice changed for most routes, with timetables shifting to local time, which tells you how much daily confusion a single reference clock can create across a giant country. So why not do what some countries do and simply force one national time? China is famous for using one official time zone across the entire country, even though its geography spans what would naturally be about 5. Russia has not chosen that path because the mismatch would be too severe. Imagine Kaliningrad and Kamchatka sharing one clock. You're talking about a 10-hour difference in solar time. In one region, 8 a.m. might feel like a normal morning. In another, that same 8 a.m. could land near the middle of the afternoon sun. Society can adapt to a couple hours of mismatch, and some places do, but 10 hours turns the clock into something close to fiction. Even with 11 zones, Russia still tolerates some mismatch because political borders do not line up with perfect solar time. If you stand near the edge of a time zone, your local solar noon might occur noticeably before or after 12 o'clock on the clock. That's unavoidable once the goal is coordination within administrative regions. In some places, the sun may reach its highest point well before noon on the clock, while in others it might happen noticeably later in the afternoon. The clock remains the same across the region, but the sky tells a slightly different story. The important question becomes how much mismatch people will accept before it disrupts daily routines. If the difference becomes too large, everyday activities begin to feel out of sync with daylight. Work may start long before sunrise in winter, or sunset may arrive much later than expected in summer evenings. Governments therefore try to keep time zones close enough to natural daylight patterns that the clock still feels reasonable for the people living within each region. There's also the reality of population distribution. A large share of Russia's population lives in the western part of the country, especially in and around the Moscow region. That creates pressure to keep Moscow time stable and familiar because it affects the most people. At the same time, the resource-rich, strategically important regions in Siberia and the Far East cannot operate on a clock designed for Moscow because their daylight and business cycles are tied to their local conditions and neighbors. Ports in the Pacific trade in Pacific hours. Mining operations and energy production run on shift systems anchored to local day-night patterns. Aviation and logistics have to interface with Asia as much as with Europe. If you're watching from the United States, it helps to think of Russia as a single nation that spans the distance from the East Coast all the way past Hawaii and into the Western Pacific, with no ocean break. In America, the Atlantic and Pacific coasts feel like edges. Russia has edges too, but they're connected by continuous land and continuous administration. That means the same government, transportation networks, and economic systems stretch across the entire distance, linking regions that experience sunrise and sunset many hours apart. That continuity is exactly why time zones become such a big deal. You can't shrug and say, that's a different region, when the region is still part of the same legal and economic system. Businesses, airlines, railways, and communication networks all have to coordinate across those vast distances. A decision made in Moscow can affect communities thousands of kilometers away, and those communities still need a clock that makes sense for their local daylight. Managing time across such a wide landscape becomes less about geography alone and more about keeping a massive country operating on a shared schedule. The history underneath all this is a story of modernization. In the early 1900s and throughout the Soviet period, Russia's timekeeping included policies like decree time, where clocks were set ahead of solar time by governmental decision, effectively shifting daylight into later hours on the clock. The goal was often practical: extend usable daylight during working hours and improve productivity across factories, farms, and government offices. Adjusting the clock became one of several tools the state used to organize economic activity across a vast territory. Those policies were adjusted, reintroduced, and reworked over decades. The modern Russian Federation inherited not only a huge geographic span, but also a legacy of timekeeping as a state tool, something that could be changed by decree to serve perceived economic or social goals. As governments experimented with different time arrangements, they were constantly balancing efficiency with everyday experience. What looked logical from a planning perspective did not always match the natural rhythm of daylight in distant regions, which is why Russia's time policies have evolved several times throughout its history. The 2011 to 2014 period is a clear example. By staying on permanent summertime, the country pushed clocks 1 hour ahead year-round. In summer, many people barely notice. In winter, that extra hour can move sunrise so late that morning routines happen in darkness. When Russia moved back in October 2014 and stopped seasonal changes entirely, it locked in a stable system that was easier to live with and easier to coordinate, even if it wasn't perfect for every longitude. Stability matters in a country this large. Every time you change time zones or offsets, you're not just adjusting clocks. You're rewriting timetables, software systems, flight schedules, TV broadcast times, school routines, and business coordination across thousands of kilometers. Banks, communication networks, and logistics companies also rely on synchronized time to keep operations running smoothly across multiple regions. Even small changes to the clock can ripple through digital systems that manage transactions, transportation, and scheduling. The larger the country, the more expensive and disruptive those changes become. Airlines must update thousands of flights, railway systems have to revise their timetables, and businesses must adjust working hours and delivery schedules. For ordinary people, the change might seem small, but across a nation as vast as Russia, it becomes a massive logistical task. Keeping time stable helps avoid confusion and allows industries, governments, and daily life to run with predictable coordination. So the final answer is not a single reason. Russia has so many time zones because the planet forces it to. The country's east-west span covers so much longitude that solar time would drift by hours and hours if it tried to compress everything into fewer zones. It keeps 11 because that number keeps local time reasonably aligned with the sun for most people while still allowing the state to operate as one system. And the exact boundaries exist where they do because time zones are drawn by governments, not by physics, following borders and practical administration more than perfect meridians. The next time you hear that it's already tomorrow somewhere in Russia, remember that this isn't a cute trivia fact. It's the operational reality of a nation living across 10 hours of Earth's rotation, trying to run trains, cities, industries, and daily life on a clock that can never make everyone perfectly happy at once. Across this enormous landscape, sunrise, work hours, and evening routines unfold at completely different moments, yet the country still has to function as a connected system. Time zones are the framework that keeps those distant regions coordinated despite the planet's constant rotation. Be curious and always seek to learn something new. Subscribe and see for yourself. Thanks for watching. And remember, the world is full of fascinating systems shaped by geography, science, and human choices.